Good morning, folks. This is Dr. Mike, and this is week 4, actually, of our studies in the Borderlands. And it's hard to believe that already that we've accomplished that much, but I'm really excited about what we're talking about. We've had some great studies this week. I hope you've been involved in those in the discussion boards. Tremendous points made, and that's the beauty of the discussion board. It's one of the more important parts of education these days is that. We get the input of a lot of different people. They see different perspectives, bring things to the forefront quite differently. To get us started, I wanted just to share a word from the Word of God with you. As I've said multiple times, one of the most difficult things about being in a Christian school is that we fail to feed ourselves. And you can literally perish from starvation spiritually for want of bread because we read for every class and we study our scriptures for every class, and we don't seem to apply them or take something for ourselves. And so from the Psalms this morning, in Psalm 119 and verse number 33 said, "Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise that you may be feared. Turn away the reproach that I dread, for your rules are good. Behold, I long for your precepts. In your righteousness, give me life." So I hope that will mean something to you that today as we go through the day, as we think about the Word of God and how important it is to our lives as Christians. So, Borderlands, as you have noted in our discussions in the past week, we always come back to that question of who is the most civilized. The Europeans that are pushing the Native Americans into this borderland region of what is now southwestern United States. And one of the interesting questions that we spent time on this past week was about the wilderness. I don't know if you've ever flown west, but I'm always struck by the desert lands that once you cross the Mississippi, it turns very quickly into uninhabitable regions, and you seem to fly over that for miles and miles. I recently lived 2 years in Colorado and a year in Texas, and I was again struck by just how much land there is there and how rugged it is and how hard it is to eke out a living. And yet we know that we're pushing Native Americans west over the Mississippi after 1828 onto land that is already occupied. And that is one point that I try to reiterate. It's not like you're pushing them onto land that's empty. You are pushing them onto land that's occupied by other Native tribes. And so that raises the chance of violence and different things that go on. But that land is relatively untamed. And so much of that land is desert, and so much of it is not plowable to grow food. And so when you push these eastern native tribes onto that land, and they've been farmers, they have to find a new way of life. Think about the turmoil that was created with these different tribes. Not only the ones who were already on the land, who had figured out ways to live and exist, but now you've got thousands of others that are being pushed onto the land that are going to starve to death. And I'm sure that many of them did. I mean, you understand why the Plains Indians depended so much on buffalo for their source of food, because that was one of the major things that was growing there. If anybody could have made a life in this area, it would definitely have been the Native Americans, but we just didn't allow them to do that. It's like saying, you got to go make a life and find a new way to live, but then we don't enable or empower them to do that. We do that still. That's still a common practice with other people groups. We say, well, to poor people, well, you need to go make a life. You need to get a job. You need to work a job. They don't think about the factors that go along with that today, such as being able to get on a computer to fill out an application or to have basic job skills. What's really interesting, what struck me in your discussions this week was this territory is still an issue as late as World War One. One of the things that drags the United States into the World War One was a telegram called the Zimmerman Telegram, that was intercepted from the Germans to Mexico, that said, if you will attack the Americans and keep them busy and keep them from getting into the war in Europe, we'll help you defeat them, and we will return to you this territory in Mexico and California that has been lost to you. So even then, the territory is still an issue. Even today, the borderlands are still kind of weak today. There's still a tremendous amount of desert there. I mean, think about what is actually in existence between, once you get into the areas like New Mexico and Utah and the Arizona, basically. And I've been through those recently, and they're beautiful and they're wonderful to look at. But as far as living there and eking out a living, there's not a whole lot there. There's not a whole lot of industry in some places, except in a few cities. But most of the states are this untamed, untouched wilderness that are still very weak when it comes to raising food and to growing food. And so basically it is quite interesting. This week we turn our attention to the Mexican era, between the Mexican War of 1840 something, 1848, all the way up through 1910, to see how these regions are going to change. This is pre-Civil War. Now let me go back a moment and talk about a couple of things. From Andrew Jackson's administration, 1828 forward, of course, the Indians and Native Americans in the East are being forced across the Mississippi. And then, we're facing, of course, pretty quickly the Civil War over slavery, because the Southern states are wanting to move into areas like Texas and these new states and set up cotton plantations and extend slavery. And so that's a big issue. With James K. Polk, who became president after Andrew Jackson, he was a Jackson protege and had much the same attitude that Jackson did. He worked out and was very interested in the land grab from Mexico. He wanted Texas, and he wanted the areas around Texas all the way through California. James K. Polk is not well known, and as I've said before, I encourage you to read presidential history because you learn so much from that. But basically, the Mexican-American War, in which the Alamo was a part, was a land grab on the part of President James K. Polk. He probably added more land to the continental United States than anybody else other than Louisiana Purchase with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson over doubled the country, and Polk would have come probably close to that, because the size of Texas and California alone are huge. But he gets what's now Oregon and Washington State from the Russians, and then he takes all these other land from the Mexicans. So basically the war is something that he perpetrated in the 1840s in order to get this land from Mexico and to settle the southern border. We're talking about how weak this area is. Think about how weak that border is even today. It leaks like a sieve. That past president and the one currently are dealing with immigration issues in which people are coming into the country illegally there. And it's always been that way. It's a very difficult border. We don't have near that problem with Canada, even though the Canadian border is much wider and much less protected. It's just that Canada doesn't let people in, and people in Canada don't want to come to the United States to live necessarily. They're not poor. And so we've got a mob of people right now moving toward the Mexican border, hoping that they're going to be let into the country at some point. So basically, as you look at this Mexican War, think about that. Think about the Alamo. Alamo becomes the rallying cry for this war, because a number of our militiamen, and remember, I think I mentioned this before, that Andrew Jackson was still fighting with militia when he defeated them in the British in the Battle of New Orleans with the 800 Kentucky Riflemen. Somewhere in this transition point, we move away from that fear of having a standing army. And that's the reason why we're still fighting with militia as late as this in our history. The War of 1812 was fought with militia. all these things, so that we had this fear of a standing army that might take the country over in a coup. And so for a long time, we didn't have an army. That is going to start developing with the Mexican War. It's going to continue very well into the Civil War, where we have major standing armies. And so after the war, of course, we don't ever have a time when we don't have an army. So that's just an important point to think about. But at the Alamo, the Mexicans attacked these militiamen, basically, of whom several, Sam Houston is there, Davy Crockett is there, Jim Bowie is there. Davy Crockett, of course, had been a congressman, and he was he's a frontiersman of very great fame. He and Daniel Boone were probably two of the best known Westerners, Kit Carson, some others, but Davy Crockett dies at the Alamo, and Jim Bowie, who is the inventor of the Bowie knife, it also does there. I had had an interesting connection with Jim Bowie. I was born in the East Totoy Valley. That is a Cherokee word, in northwestern South Carolina, just almost at the North Carolina border. And I think I mentioned to you that when I was born, I could look out my window, had I been able, and see the old grounds of the Lower Cherokee tribes. It was in a tree nursery that my grandfather owned and sold to the state. But Jim Bowie's family, somewhere in the 1820s or something, Daniel Boone, who made his living partially by bringing settlers into areas to settle, had brought two families in particular into that East Totoy Valley. On the lower end was the Chapman family. They're still there and are descendants of Johnny Appleseed. If you remember, Johnny Appleseed's name was Johnny Chapman, and he sowed apple trees everywhere he traveled. The other was the Bowie family, who were descendants of Jim Bowie. Both families are still there today, 2021, and they're still very much present in the East Totoy Valley, even though it's turned into quite a different place than I'm sure their ancestors found it. So just, give you a little bit of connection there. But I grew up knowing both of those. But Jim Bowie died in the Alamo. This becomes the rallying cry, much like the Spanish-American War in 1898 with the bombing of the Maine, USS Maine, which is widely believed that our own insurgents blew it up as a rallying point. Every American war, including the Revolution, including the Civil War, including all these others, had to be sold to the American people to get them involved. And we still do that. If you remember weapons of mass destruction justifying the war in Iraq, you understand that we continue to do that. We have to justify to the American people their need for continuing warfare. So basically, the Alamo becomes the point at which we, this is the rallying point to get people involved and take the Mexican War seriously. And of course, we do. We take the state of Texas, and the Rio Grande becomes the southern border for the United States. And so these are some very important times, and you will have this week some very interesting things to comment on. Let me encourage you to work on your paper. And let me make this statement. When you pick a great subject, it is incumbent upon you to do a great job. It is a shame to have a great subject and do a sloppy job. Be sure you do your research. If you want something to write about, it comes from the process of researching and reading and looking at your subject. And then when you sit down to write, you just overflow onto the page all the things that you've learned. That is the correct way to do research. Research is not a one source paper. That is not a research. That is a report, something like you did in high school and you copied out the encyclopedia. Those days are gone. Research is where you have more than one source and you use those sources in the paper to support claims that you want to make. So ask yourself, what do I want to say about this paper? What points do I want to make, and how do I want to make them? And so let me encourage you to do that. Do the same thing with your discussion boards. Do not leave discussion boards blank. And you need to really do research and write something of substance. Discussion boards are not a place where you knock your brain out of gear and just write whatever you want to. And no, you are reading and studying. When your discussion board is short, it says to me you haven't read your materials for the week. You haven't watched your videos for the week. You haven't prepared yourself to write. You're just trying to fill up space. And believe me, I read every word. So, you're not going to get past me with that. You need to make every point you can make. Let me encourage you to write something of substance. Watch your spelling and your grammar. You're in college. It is not a place where you, just write ever how you want to write. You need to write things that are well done and well documented, and spelling and grammar is good. And I should not have to correct your spelling and grammar. So basically, those are the realities of college life, that we're now at a different level. You should have your grammar and your spelling things already solved and settled when you get to this age. And if you don't, which sometimes, a lot of times it happens, go back and fix them now, because it will not get any easier as you move forward. I am available. I'm more than happy to talk to you. Please let me know how I can be of help, and we'll talk to you next week.